Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, clashing with Congress. When presidents wrestle with lawmakers, takedowns are rare. A scholar tells us Congress tends to get its way. We will dig into the history and the current battles as well. Nearly 100 days into his term, will President Trump be able to slash taxes despite Congress's fear of deficits? Trump's expected to prevail on the spending bill to keep the government running, but that took postponing his wall till the fall. A veteran Beltway insider will explain how the game is played. Plus, later in our evidence-based politics segment, we will examine one of the many Trump reforms that do not require congressional approval, deregulating the internet. Is it the end of a free and open net or a new beginning? First, Congress versus the president. Joining us, John Lawrence. For 38 years, he served as a senior staff member in the House of Representatives, the last 8 as chief of staff to Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi. Currently, he's a visiting professor at the University of California's Washington campus. He joins us via Skype from D.C. Welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brian. Happy to be here.
First, as a little bit of debrief from the first 100 days, do you think there was a big lesson learned by this administration from the failure of the health reform bill?
I'm not sure that any lesson has been learned, and the evidence that I would bring forward on that is that they seem to be repeating the problem with the tax bill, which is once again not conducting the kind of detailed conversation with members of Congress on a personal basis, on a caucus-wide, even as a bipartisan basis, that generally is necessary for success with these very large, controversial, and complex legislative packages.
I watched the news conference with the White House officials Gary Cohn, Chief Economic Advisor, and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin when they were rolling out the outlines of the tax plan today, and they made a point of stressing that they have been working with congressional leaders. I didn't hear that when they tried health reform with other officials a few months ago. Do you have a sense, I don't know if you're up on the most recent details on that, but do you have a sense that maybe they're doing tax reform differently and only the details need to be hammered out?
Well, of course, in tax policy, details are everything. A little detail can spin out to hundreds of billions of dollars. So there is no little detail when you're dealing with taxes. But as recently as yesterday, the Democratic ranking member on the Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, for example, said that he hadn't heard anything. There's a difference between informing the Congress of what you're doing and consulting with the Congress. And Congress takes very seriously tax legislation. You know, under the Constitution, by law, by the Constitution, all tax legislation must originate in the House of Representatives. And so, of course, any president has the discretion to send a proposal down, but the prescription for success is really to work in developing the proposal, not to work on getting the Congress to accept your proposal after the fact.
Obama wasn't very good at this, was he?
I think that his work with the Congress on developing legislation has actually been underestimated. I was in many, many meetings, whether it was on health care or on stimulus, on the fiscal cliff, on the extension of the Bush-era tax cuts in 2012, where there were very detailed ongoing meetings between not only members of the Democratic caucus, but members of the Republican conference and certainly Republican leaders such as Senator McConnell and Speaker Boehner. So to be quite honest about it, I think that President Obama gets a bit of gets underrated in terms of his willingness to participate in those discussions. Now, whether or not those other members were always happy with the outcome is another matter. But certainly there was to characterize as some have that the president was not collaborative, I think is just inaccurate. And I say that because I was in the room when the members were there.
Well, what defines collaborative? What defines collaborative? Because a lot of people have written that Obama was not very good at socializing with members of Congress. He didn't have the backslapping relationship, or that trivializes it. He didn't have people over for drinks or coffee or things like that on a regular basis and build the relationships on a human level. Tell me if that's not been your experience But is collaboration something other than that?
Yeah, I think collaboration is sitting down with people and going through the details of legislative proposals and listening to what they're talking about. And then obviously some are agreed and some are disagreed upon. The other aspect of what you're talking about, the personal relationship, and of course personal relationships are very, very important in Congress and in politics in general. I think there, the people who are friends of mine in the administration challenged that. And they would tell you, oh, we had people over for coffee or we had people over for receptions. But I think the test here is that if members didn't feel that they were being paid enough attention to, then they weren't being paid enough attention to. I think the question is, did that then influence their willingness to support the administration or not support the administration? And that's where I think there is a discrepancy between the two. I think President Obama could have had people over for hot dogs and beer, and it wouldn't have changed a lot of votes on the way.
How much does Trump need the Democrats to get the tax reform plan through, since he has Republican majorities in both houses?
Well, unless the tax proposal scores out as neutral, and we'll have to see what the Congressional Budget Office says about that, he's going to need 60 votes.
Revenue neutral. In other words, it wouldn't increase the deficit. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. Right. And unfortunately, a lot of times when these big tax cuts come along, they are predicated on what Republicans call either supply-side economics or dynamic scoring, which presumes that the growth resulting from the tax cut is going to compensate for any deficits created by the tax cuts. And as I think you know, that generally doesn't occur, and we end up with very large deficits. One of the real problems with the tax proposal, which has been rolled out in very general terms to this point, is we don't have any scoring on how much it's going to cost. And there have been suggestions that this could add trillions of dollars to the deficit if the growth projections don't turn out to be as optimistic as the administration suggests. So I don't know to what extent that causes genuine problems on the conservative wing of the Republican Party, which would cause him to lose some of the Freedom Caucus people and thereby necessitate picking up Democratic votes. That has been the method of dealing with continuing spending resolutions or tax extensions going back 7 years now of the Republican majority. They've not been able to win in the House the most conservative Republican bloc, the Tea Party or Freedom Caucus, and they've had to go to Mrs. Pelosi and to the Democrats and say, I need 40 votes or I need 60 votes. And that, of course, has only flared up additional intra-party problems on the Republican side, which ultimately led Speaker Boehner to quit.
Do you think, in our last 30 seconds, that the Democrats will play ball with the Trump administration at all on anything, considering how inflamed the base is, seeing Trump as a bigot and all of that?
I thought it was interesting after the health care bill went down in flames before it even got to the floor that both Mrs. Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer said, look, if you want to come forward and deal with the problems of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, we're prepared to sit down and do that. And I've seen, certainly in Mrs. Pelosi's case, a willingness to work collaboratively with Republican presidents. We did with President Bush, even on very controversial and politically dangerous issues. But I think that that's going to be a very difficult sell if it looks like the Trump administration is either not willing to back off on the idea of repealing the health care law, or if the tax bill that they propose skews too much to the most affluent groups of percentage of the population. I don't think Democrats can go down that road.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be talking to you.
This is POTUS 2017. I'm Brian Lehrer. From a historical perspective, how unusual are President Trump's troubles with Congress? The Obamacare debacle, his inability to get bills through quickly, even with his own party in power. Joining us, a scholar of presidential power, George C. Edwards. He is a distinguished professor of political science at Texas A&M University and editor of Presidential Studies Quarterly. If we listed even half his books, we'd have no time to talk. Professor Edwards joins us via Skype from College Station, Texas. Welcome.
Thanks very much.
You want to go over the origin of the first 100 days a little bit? FDR declared it. Was it a matter of politics?
Well, the FDR example is the classic example. And of course, it was on very unusual times when you had a terrible catastrophe facing the country. And FDR actually didn't expect to have 100 days of great legislative success and productivity. He actually expected very little in the first days and was going to send Congress home. And he found that the country was so desperate and members of Congress were so desperate to take action to respond to the Great Depression that he kept Congress in session and hurriedly wrote legislation that became the first New Deal. And that's where we get the notion of 100 days.
And I think the number that I've seen is 17 bills passed by Congress during that time.
Well, there were, generally we view it as 15 major pieces of legislation. There was other legislation as well. And that's, of course, remarkable, unprecedented, and never to be repeated.
This year we saw President Trump start with some major executive orders before even really trying to get anything through Congress. Is that historically unique?
No, presidents always turn to executive orders, or they turn to executive orders early in their tenure. It's mostly for symbolic purposes. They may have real consequences, but they're sending messages to their supporters, for example, to the religious right or the socially conservative people about what they want to do about abortion, let us say, if they happen to be Republicans. And if they're Democrats, they send the opposite signal. And they can do a lot of that with the stroke of a pen. But the real lasting legacies have to come through legislation, and when we're talking about domestic policy.
Has Trump's problems with the Republican Congress been historically unusual for when presidents have control of both parties? I should say when presidents' parties have control of both houses of Congress as well?
Yes, there haven't been that many examples of Republican presidents who start their tenure with control of both houses of Congress. But normally, Republicans want to follow the Republican president and are pretty responsive. They certainly were to Ronald Reagan when he asked for tax cuts and big increases in the defense expenditures. They were also to George W. Bush when he asked for tax cuts and later when he asked for an education reform, the No Child Left Behind policy. Those are all first-year initiatives. President Trump is facing a less coherent Republican contingent in Congress. By coherent, I don't mean that they're crazy. I'm not suggesting that. I mean that they don't share the same ideological views. So you've got one segment of the party which basically isn't interested in governing that much and not interested in passing legislation such as health care reform. And you've got another segment of the party which is very concerned about maintaining benefits for people, but perhaps trying to deliver them in a more effective, more efficient way. And then you've got others in between, and they've not been able to reach agreement at this point.
Trump's rhetoric, or who he says he's for or against, is so changeable. One minute he's going to run primary candidates against the members of the Freedom Caucus because they wouldn't agree on a health care bill. The next, he's trying to craft the next version of the health care bill with the Freedom Caucus, as has been going on this week, and getting ready to vilify the Democrats. Does that help him, or does that hurt him with Congress, or doesn't that matter because everybody understands you make your political coalitions where you can find them from week to week?
Well, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult in as much as members of Congress don't know whether he'll keep his word, what he really stands for, and what he'll stand for next week. And so that is a problem in putting together a coalition. You need a lot of interpersonal trust here. But at the same time, the president is a bit desperate. He wants to have a success. He wants achievements. He wants to keep his promises. And he has to try to find support when he can. I think also that it's a reflection of the president not having strong views. He didn't come with a health care plan, and so he's trying to cobble it together here on the fly. That's not the easiest thing to do, particularly with something as complex as health care. And that means that he's not laying down his principles and saying Congress has to respond to them and then keeping his word on that. He's really in a reactive mode. And so in the first round, he had to react to Paul Ryan and the House's health care plan, which wasn't his health care plan, and which clearly didn't keep the promises he'd made to the public about having less expensive health care and no one losing their health care.
FDR, in the era before television, used radio addresses to go over the head of the media directly to the public. Donald Trump, of course, uses Twitter, but I think FDR used radio to try to persuade Americans to his side. It seems to me that Trump uses Twitter to fire up his base while not caring that much that he seems to be alienating almost everybody else. Do you see it the same way? And does Trump have any choice in our era of polarized media?
Well, FDR certainly used radio effectively, and we all revered the fireside chats. Mostly, FDR was trying to get broad support, as opposed to support for a specific policy initiative. He rarely used the fireside chats to say, I've got a bill before Congress, and I want you to write your congressman and support me. So he was looking for broad support, which he generally received, certainly in the early years. Trump has 28+ million Twitter followers. That's half of what President Obama had when he left office, but it's still a very large number. President Trump's tweets certainly play to the base, and he seems to be particularly interested in his base. Now, all presidents want a base and want to maintain the base, and that's key in coalition building. But at the same time you fire up the base, you don't want to alienate everyone else because your base isn't big enough. So I think it has been a problem for the president. It's very good for preaching to the choir to send these inflammatory messages, but it's not very good for expanding the congregation.
I didn't know that Obama had 28 million more Twitter followers than Trump does. Don't tell Trump or he'll say that 30 million of Obama's were fake.
I wouldn't be surprised.
How much is partisan media a factor, in your opinion? And as a historian, I think you'll agree that we had almost nothing but partisan media in this country until 1950 or so, when the advent of broadcasting, gave the television networks an economic imperative to try to be really, really broad. Before that, it was newspapers that were identified with parties for the most part. And now, in a certain sense, we're going back to the historical norm, even though the baby boom generation thinks that broadcasting was the historical norm. How do you see it?
Well, you're absolutely right that when we began, we had highly partisan newspapers. In fact, Thomas Jefferson put a fellow on the payroll of the State Department as an interpreter, although he knew no other languages, and his real job was to create an opposition newspaper to George Washington. So this has been going on since the beginning. Now, in modern times, you're absolutely right. The mainstream media has tried to be nonpartisan. Editorial pages of major newspapers aside, they haven't tried to be nonpartisan. Now we have, with the internet age, a fragmentation of the media and a fragmentation of media audiences. So rather than informing us more effectively, we actually get informed less effectively because we tend to go to sites where the information is a bit biased and sites that reinforce our views. Now, that's really good for, again, the president's base, but it's very bad for trying to reach a broader audience. It's also very bad for the norms of politics and the norms that are, I think, central to democracy, like the importance of facts and political discourse. And if you don't care about facts, and if you only care about saying spectacular things or highly critical things and not doing the reality testing, I think democracy seriously suffers.
Professor Edwards, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Time for Evidence-Based Politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. The new administration can make plenty of progress on its agenda without Congress. It's already ordered the easing of Dodd-Frank financial regulations, reversed plans to save some wetlands, reversed executive orders that banned the sales of guns to the mentally ill, and protected the LGBT community, and much more. But will Trump reverse the net neutrality rules that regulate the Internet? In 2015, under President Obama, the Federal Communications Commission set in motion rules that classify broadband, the Internet pipeline into your home, as a public utility like electricity or water, that prevented broadband providers like Verizon or your cable company from favoring rich content companies like Amazon with expensive, faster connections over smaller sites which could not afford such high speeds. They did this so you can use any site the same way that you like as you can today. But President Trump's FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai announced a plan to scrap those Obama-era rules and, quote, return to the light touch regulatory framework that served our nation so well, unquote. So is this the end of a free and open Internet or an unfettered new beginning? Joining us via Skype from Berkeley, California, Larry Downes. He is the project director for the Georgetown University Center for Business and Public Policy and author of Big Bang Disruption, Strategy in the Age of Devastating Innovation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Can you talk about that concept that the FCC commissioner came out with today that I think had been used before 2015 as well, a light touch regulatory framework?
Yes, well, actually, FCC chairmen for the last 20 years have all claimed that what they're doing is light touch regulation. It's not a very useful expression. But what the chairman announced today in a speech was a proposal that's coming probably tomorrow, in which he will start the process of rolling back that public utility classification that you mentioned that was done in 2015. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of the net neutrality rules. The rules themselves were a second part of that 2015 order. What the previous FCC did was first reclassify and then use that authority to pass the rules, that being the third time that they tried to do it. The first two times, courts had rejected their effort as being outside of their authority.
Why would the Internet not be regulated as a utility? When we think about the bills we get and the way we use it, why is it anything but like the electricity that comes into our home or the water or the gas?
Yeah, well, I mean, thinking about the sort of current quality of our power systems and our water systems and our mass transit systems, we're very fortunate that the Internet hasn't been regulated as a utility. Utility classification has been around for about 100 years in various forms in various industries. And it's really always been considered, both by economists and by regulators, as sort of the last ditch when markets just simply don't work. And the only way to get a universal service at a predictable price is to create a government monopoly in which only one provider is going to provide the service under strict control, even quasi-governmental control. It's obviously not the way our Internet service has worked, either on a wired or a wireless basis. And the result has been very good. We have multiple, certainly in wireless, we have multiple national competitors. We have a complete amount of new investment being done. Utilities typically don't replace their infrastructure every few years with new technologies. And obviously we have competition, which you wouldn't have if you were a true utility.
And the idea of net neutrality, the way I laid it out in the introduction, that it makes sense for the consumer, as far as President Obama was concerned, that we wouldn't have to worry whether somebody was exploiting us because a big user like Google or Amazon could pay the Internet service providers to have really high speeds into our home if they were allowed to charge that, whereas smaller providers of content, news or products or anything, couldn't afford to keep up with them, and therefore we lose choice. I have a feeling you don't look at it that way. Why not?
No, actually I do. I mean,
I
think there is real risk, but the reality is that sort of none of these worst case scenarios had ever come to pass. Even in 2015, the FCC said these rules it was passing were prophylactic. That's the word that they used to control against future bad behavior. I still think, first of all, that the rules are a good idea in the sense of these principles about blocking and throttling and transparency about how networks are managed are absolutely a good idea. The problem all along has been that the FCC, Congress had just not given it the authority to regulate that. However, the Federal Trade Commission, which did have the authority until 2015, was regulating broadband ISPs quite aggressively. In fact, they had taken over 100 cases up until 2015, going after practices having to do with advertising and pricing and other kinds of disclosures that they felt the providers weren't living up to.
Light touch regulation is a nice idea if there is only light touch exploitation of consumers by the companies involved. Are there special interests here that the Trump administration is doing the bidding of?
Well, I don't know if it's the Trump administration. The FCC is an independent regulatory agency. It does not, once the chairman is appointed by the president, that's really the end of the White House's official involvement in that agency. They can't dictate what it does and doesn't do. But obviously, there are all sorts of interests lined up here. Most of them are not exactly disclosing their true agendas here. Though this has been described as a discussion about net neutrality, at least for the 10 years that I've been unfortunately stuck paying attention to it, the reality is it's never really been about those basic principles. It's really always been about whether or not the internet should be regulated as a public utility. And there are, certainly public advocacy groups as well as some large companies who would like to see it treated as utility, and obviously the providers themselves who don't want to see it as a utility.
We just have 20 seconds left. Why do you use the word stuck? Is it because it's really so obscure and opaque to the general public and you have to explain it every time you bring it up?
Well, it's because the language that's used by both sides is really very misleading. We don't really have a serious discussion about the economics of utilities. If we had that conversation, I think it'd be over pretty fast.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour, keeping watch on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. Next time, we begin looking at the next 1,300 days. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.